I want to begin with this book on the screen. The Fourth Turning is here. We're going to be borrowing a lot of insights from that book. And I've got the heading on the screen, Generations and the Four Seasons of Both Life and History. Now let's start with thinking about the seasons of your life. Childhood, young adulthood, middle age, and senior. How many were there right there? Well, there were 4. And each one could be symbolized as a season of the year, could it not? Spring, childhood. Summer, young adulthood. Fall, being middle age. And winter, being a senior. Let's break these down even more specifically now into these quadrants. Full adulthood and begins at 21. Then you're a young adult in the spring season. When do you reach middle age? Now, I might have opinions about this at this stage in life. I may have a bias because I just learned they define middle age as the age the youngest president ever elected was when he was elected president, and that age was 43. So I must face the music. Middle age is a wonderful fall season. I called young adulthood spring. I meant to call it summer. Spring is childhood. Young adulthood is summer. Middle age is fall. And then when do you qualify for Medicare? You're a full senior at 65. So from 0 to 21, 21 to 43, 43 to 65, and 65 and onward are the 4 seasons of life. Now this says the 4 seasons of life and history. The Bible speaks of these 4 seasons as being seed time and harvest, summer and winter. Seed time and harvest, summer and winter. Spring, fall, summer, winter. And the 4 seasons of your life, being akin to those 4, could also be seen generationally. Because if one's lifespan is comprised of 4 seasons with tendencies and trends to them, then maybe entire generations will have those trends, and history will then cycle in this way. Let's take a look. First of all, generational views of history are totally biblical. The Bible doesn't produce a timeline of the year such and such, BC or AD, like we do. It creates the timeline based on generations. And so begat such, and he lived to so many years, and then he died. And when he was such years old, he begat such and such. And so that's how you date history, is generations. In fact, the word generation simply means to generate, that which is brought into being, like the Genesis, the beginning of the Bible and of creation of this earth. So to generate, the generations are a way to think about history biblically, for sure. And again, if we have 4 seasons, maybe society has 4 seasons because we have it individually, and society is made up of individuals. Generations have their own unique character and their unique trends. And here I bring in demographer and historian Neil Howe, his colleague, the late Strauss, Strauss and Howe theory of the cyclical history has taken the history profession by storm. And what they found is 80 to 105-year periods of time that tend to cycle and tend to be broken down into 20-odd-year periods, just like the length of a human lifespan. And history tends to cycle with spring, like a rebirth, summer, an awakening, fall, an unraveling, and winter, for our purposes here, we're going to focus a lot on winter, a crisis season. Rebirth, an awakening, an unraveling, and a crisis. Spring, summer, fall, and winter. And then after the winter, a new order is established with a new awakening, and things tend to cycle. Now, is this some, kind of sideshow type of scholarship here? Well, no. Strauss and Howe previously took the history profession by storm when they theorized these things, and now they're transpiring before us. And it was none other than the Vice President of the United States back in the 90s, Al Gore, who said this was the best history book that he'd ever read. It's laying out the cyclical view of history, and so the elite see predictive power in this analysis that we are doing, is what I'm getting at there with citing Al Gore. Not as an authority, but as somebody who appreciates the value of it within the power elite. The 80 to 105-year period of time is referred to by these scholars as a seculum, and as I heard that word, that reminded me of Novus Ordo Seclorum on the U.S. seal, a new order of the seculum that was on the very founding of this country, a rebirth for sure. Crises and rebirths you'll probably notice most in American history. So we're going to focus on these two for just a second. You tell me if you think that there's a pattern here, and we're going to see the timeline of the pattern as well. The first crisis, the American Revolution. The very name of Thomas Paine's famous publication, The American Crisis, That pretty much typifies that season, that winter season, which was then followed by a rebirth, the founding of this country. 1781 was the British surrender to the United States. Fast forward 80 years from 1781, and what do you get? Another crisis, the Civil War. And that was a house divided against itself cannot stand. That's crisis language, right? Which was then followed by a new order that was established. A nation. We went from the United States are going to war with Britain in 1812 to the United States is going to war with Spain in 1898. We went from a them to an it. We went from an us to an it. The United States are going to such and such is what used to be said before the Civil War. But the Civil War happens during a period of nationalism and the consolidation also in Europe of the German states and the Italian cities and provinces. So you start to get a nation with a stronger national government, a new order, a new form of government really at that point after the Civil War. So a rebirth. So crisis followed by rebirth. American Revolution was followed by the founding of this country. Civil War was followed by a new nation in a way. Then, fast forward 80 years from 1861. And what year do you get to? 1941. So we went forward 80 years from the Revolutionary War conclusion to the beginning of the Civil War. Now 80 years from the beginning of the Civil War to the beginning of World War II. A day that will live in infamy. Is that not crisis language? Definitely World War II was a crisis season. Followed by a rebirth. The national security state, the bipolar world, America having this post-war new governmental structure. Fast forward 80 years from Pearl Harbor. And you get 2021, you get mandates, you get a situation where we were all going, this is not normal. This is certainly a crisis, and we're still in the crisis season. I'll give you that hint. We're going to set dates for when this crisis season was scheduled to begin. That was already. And when our present crisis season is scheduled to intensify and to wrap up. But it's interesting to me, just as a history guy, that the three presidents that were the president during our three crisis seasons were all known as, are still to this day known as the greatest presidents. So they had positive leadership that brought us somewhere and a rebirth, but you have to wonder, is this always good, and is the same going to apply today? Do we have that same level of optimism and leadership in Washington? Most Americans do not. Fast facts about the winter season. The crisis season is very historic, as we note. Everybody knows about the Revolutionary War and the Civil War and in World War II, our first three crisis seasons, but they actually are triggered by an economic crisis, a debt deleveraging, which pushes us into a crisis era. The dates listed on the screen, these things happened. So our crisis phase, our winter season that we are living in now, began in 2008. Interestingly, in 2 out of the 3 previous winter seasons, a president died. 1 was assassinated, 2 out of 3 died. That might not mean anything, but there's always, this is where we're going to go with this. This is the most important part of this historical cycle of the crisis season. There's always a giant war. Now, this harkens back to our 1990s Project 2025. They were the ones saying World War III is going to come. You had the Deagle report saying massive population reduction. You have all these indicators pointing that direction. This is where we're going with this also. So if you zoom out, though, not just to 3, you might be like, well, cycle of 3 isn't as solid to go on. What if you zoom out to Anglo-American history and look at 7 cycles? 7 cycles of Anglo-American history and for the totality of the modern age, okay? There were 6 giant wars in Anglo-American history during winter seasons of these cycles. The first one was victory in the War of Roses, achieved in 1487. 1588, the British defeated the Spanish Armada. In 1688, it was the Glorious Revolution. In 1781, the Americans defeated the British. In 1865, it was the end of the Civil War. 1945, the end of World War II. And so if every single time you're in a winter season of this 80 to 105 year cycle, there's a giant war in that winter season, then we should not be surprised to see war intensifying already. And we could say, now, 2025 and following, or has it already begun? We'll come back to that. But I put on the screen, expect giant wars, simply because of the cycles of history. We would be shocked and surprised to not see it. It's not a guarantee, it's not a certainty, it's not a prophecy. I mean, there is war and rumors of war in the last days, but you get the point. What is the most likely time window? We want to ask ourselves. Knowing these seasons and how they function, what is society like during a spring season, during a summer season, during a fall season, during a winter season? And which type of society is most likely to produce a Revelation 13 Mark of the Beast type of crisis? Well, let's think about summer seasons. We haven't mentioned those much yet. A summer season is known as an awakening. And again, I'm looking to Howe and Strauss in their scholarship on history. These are some summer awakenings that have happened in the last 500 years. Martin Luther, 1530s and 40s. Of course, he began it in 1517, but the Protestant Reformation really got moving quickly in the 1530s and 40s with a Europe-wide awakening. The Puritan awakening of the 1630s and 40s in England. The Great Awakening in the colonies of the United States in the 1740s and 50s. Then you get in the 1800s, in the 1830s and 40s, and I'm citing secular research right now, I happen to know and believe in this strongly, but the Millerite awakenings and the Second Advent awakening, the Great Second Advent awakening of the early to mid 19th century. Is that not fascinating that this plays into secular history? But there were other awakenings at the time that I would call biblically a counterfeit awakening, like the utopian movements. We're going to build heaven on earth by making a perfect society here. Then you fast forward to the next awakening. That was the 60s and 70s. Those maybe who are listening to this, who lived through that, you remember it was the age of Aquarius and the awakening and the hippies and the Jesus movement, and there was all this sort of religious philosophical awakening happening. Passionate and moralizing attacks or critiques of the previous reigning orthodoxy. We're in a season of change and development awakening out of the spring sort of straitjacket is what that's viewed as being conformity. Well, they asked college students in the 60s and 70s, what's more important to you in surveys? What's more important to you? Developing a meaningful philosophy of life or getting ahead and succeeding? And 2 to 1, they said, philosophy of life. This is awakening season, generation, culture, par excellence. It's all about your philosophy of life for 2 to 1 versus getting ahead. Then you transition to fall, and in the 80s and 90s, the unraveling, if you will, the fall season of Generation X, they were asked the same question in college, and it reverses completely. 2 to 1, it's individualism, man. Let's succeed. I'm going to be everything I can be. And then meaningful philosophy of life isn't as important in an unraveling. That's awakening talk. So the culture changes. We've lived this lifetime, so we can see these tendencies. We can see and note that the 60s and 70s were a thing culturally, and the 80s and 90s were a thing culturally. They're the package deal. And you can see that changing over time to the 80s and 90s being, as I mentioned a second ago, individualism. Not a conformist generation like the spring, not a just, kind of conforming to an awakening of sorts in the summer season, but it's all about individualism in the fall season. If we're asking this question, what is the most likely time window for a fulfillment of Revelation 13? If you're going to try to place the whole world wonders after the beast somewhere in history, do you think the 90s would be a likely candidate where it's all about individualism? Unlikely. And we should always be ready. If some fall season transpires in the future, I don't want us to be like, oh no, there's no way it's going to happen. No, we have a sovereign God. We're looking at likelihoods here. We're looking at what happened in the past. It didn't transpire into the final events in the 90s. It was a time of cultural individualism, and there's not a whole lot of war, famine, plague during the prosperity of a summer or fall season. They tend to be more economically prosperous. So cultural individualism, peace, and prosperity, summer and fall, are usually not going to be your best likely candidate. This is where it brings it home to our day. What season of history are we in right now? We are in the winter season. We are in the crisis season. And that moves society throughout history. It always does. And you'll notice this is happening now. It moves us from individualism, individual liberty, individual conscience, over to conquest of opposing ideologies. What we call cancel culture. We call this a tribal group collective identity that is polarized in 2 different groups that we'll talk about again in a moment when we talk Civil War again. So this, you're going, yeah, this is culturally what's happening in our winter crisis season. So when we ask this question, what is the most likely time window for a fulfillment of Revelation 13? You're probably going to want to look at a winter season for the most likelihood, the highest likelihood for this type of thing. Because it's no longer about personal individual conscience like it is in the fall season. It's no longer about an awakening and philosophy of life like it was in the summer season. It is about community mobilization to meet the crisis. And we're going to analyze that more in a moment, but it's going to have a religious zeal to it many times, even if it's not a religious movement. But the bottom line is divisions increase, and it's holy war time in a time of crisis, because we've got to meet the crisis. We've got to mobilize everything together. You could postulate the spring or rebirth season being a candidate as well. Because we had a new republic formed, then we had the slaves freed and kind of a second republic, and then you had the post-World War II and kind of a third republic. And so we tend to view these things as positive in the past, but it's possible to have an awakening that is not healthy for freedom and principles that we believe in from the Bible. It's possible that a new institutional order, which is what a spring season is, it's a founding of something new, and tremendous conformity happens. During the winter also, but in the spring season, the conformity happens under a new and highly trusted system. If we're looking for a time window for Revelation 13, you could say, well, Israel's monarchy wasn't positive, and they had a new institutional order, and they got monarchy out of it. So you can get something destructive to freedom out of a new institutional system. So that spring season is a time of new culture, new creating of new culture, following new leadership, and conforming to the group that is adoring their government and their system. Individual dissent is not permitted in the spring season, let alone celebrated. Not celebrated, let alone permitted. It's a time when you could see global straitjacket of conformity, a new order that is a great counterfeit error, enforcement of the mark of the beast, perhaps. But the crisis phase, I think, fits with the prophetic scenario better because it's war and famine and pestilence, and many more signs of the times that are destructive and crisis-oriented that usher in the call and demand for the mark of the beast system. So it's possible that at the tail end of the crisis season, you transition into a spring rebirth of a new system that, people are still fresh off of the crisis and they're like, go get them and persecute. And it could, these lines aren't that clear where one begins and the next starts always. It's possible that it could happen during a spring season. It's highly possible that it would be during a crisis season. Now, what to expect during a crisis season? I want you to know about the crisis season, not only because of our speculations here about the most likely season for a mark of the beast type of crisis, but because it's the season we live in now. And I just want you to understand what a crisis looks like, what is the anatomy and the sequence of events in a crisis, so that we can know what to expect and what's coming next. First of all, there's a precursor to the crisis, and that typically transpires during the previous or fall season. So this happened during our first crisis. There was a French and Indian War before the Revolutionary War, Mexican-American War before the Civil War, and World War I before World War II, and September 11, 2001 before our present crisis season began in 2008. Secondly, there's a catalyst that marks the beginning of the crisis. So this is where it began. And sometimes you don't know when it's happening, but you look down, you're like, yep, Lexington and Concord started with the first fire that shot her around the world, the Revolutionary War. Fort Sumter, of course, 1861. 1929 stock market crash actually inaugurated this crisis season that happened in the World War II generation. And then another financial crash, 2008, ushered in our present crisis season that we are still in and will be in for a few more years if time should last. Mobilization, step 3. Mobilization of the society to meet the crisis, either in a unified fashion or in a polarized fashion with two opposing groups hating and destroying each other in civil war, like happened in the 1860s. Fourth step in the sequence of events in a winter crisis season. Consolidation of power to meet the crisis. Maximum collective energy. Leaders redirect all institutional energy to meet a common goal with an intensity that nobody foresaw before the catalyzing event. So this takes the world by storm, and all of a sudden people are being swept up, and you're like, what is going on? This is crazy time, and then that leads into the climax. There's little concern about harsh government means to meet the crisis. We move from personal fury to public fury, meaning through government organs. Whether the enemies are internal or external, the enemies of the state become categorized, demonized, vilified. Liberties are restricted, and you get strict censorship. Public action occurs in a tsunami-like momentum. It's more like nature's most violent storms than a mere winter season, because this is one thing upon the other, bam, 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 bam. An apocalyptic level type of thing that you read, a storm is coming, relentless in its fury. We've seen this process repeat in previous crises, and within one crisis, it can cycle. Like you had the 9/11 crisis that led to a lot of these things that we just read. Then you had the great financial crisis, 2008, and that led to this sequence of events. And then COVID, that led to this sequence of events. And there is more coming that is about to burst upon the world as an overwhelming surprise. Have you read that somewhere before? There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. I don't always affirmatively quote Vladimir Lenin, but that is an insightful statement and is historically correct. There are times where not much change seems to occur, and then bam, in weeks, decades of change happens. So we definitely don't have the end of history in a crisis season. We didn't arrive at universalization of liberal democracy in the end of history, like Francis Fukuyama said in 1991, because there was a crisis season coming by 2008. So you can think of the second half of the crisis season. So there's our crisis season, by the way. 2008, I never gave you the end point. And I'm not saying time will even last that long. I'm just saying historically, by generation lengths and previous cycles, we should expect it to wrap up 2030 to 2034, the current crisis season, giving way then to rebirth. Now, typically, the first half of a crisis season is serious. 9/11, great financial crisis, and COVID. Very serious. The second half, COVID was kind of into the second half actually, gets extremely serious and crescendos. So the crisis events that we should expect, I mean, basically we're in, right now, heading into 2025, and this could leak into 2024 even as we're recording this, but 2025 and following, second half of this decade, we're calling that beginning right now. We'll call it May 7, 2024 for other reasons that are kind of fun. And they're not Bible prophecy date setting. 1844 was the last date in Bible prophecy. But we are right now in 1861. We are in 1941. We are in this period where the big mega events take place cyclically. So what does that mean? 1861, 1941? Did you follow that? What does that mean? Giant war. That was Civil War. That was World War II.